As human beings, there is within each of us a tension. It is the tension of our earthly bodies and our heavenly capacity. Our earthly bodies and our heavenly capacity. What I mean by that is that all of us is bound to this earth in flesh and bone, and we know the weaknesses that come with being bound to this earthly body. We have temptations and challenges, physical needs, physical weaknesses, all sorts of challenges that we face as people of flesh and bone, of flesh and blood. Uh, we also know within us a spiritual capacity. There are times when we are amazed at our sense of substance and character and ways in which we have knowledge of the truth of the world. These two at times find themselves at odds with each other, particularly as we esteem to be our best selves. Sometimes we are sorely disappointed because, as Paul says, it seems that sometimes that which I want to do is that which I do not do, and the very thing which I do not want to do is the thing that I do. I think that most of us can relate to that statement at one time or another, or perhaps continuously at different occasions in our lives. There seems to be a duplicitousness within us, a hypocrisy, a sense in which we are doubly minded. We have two capacities, it seems, within us. Last night, I talked a little bit about the fact that part of what it means to be Christian is to live with this tension. Part of what it means to be completely alive is not to succumb to the physical nature of who we are to the extent that we give way to our earthly passions, but rather that we elevate the spiritual capacity and we live with the tension between our earthly selves and our spiritual potential. That tension is part of what it means to be alive. Indeed, I'd argue that tension, or a sense of managing two poles of differentness, is part of what so much of life is about. Part of the reason that we like sunrises and sunsets, because it's neither night nor day. It's a liminal time, a time on the line, in between the two, when we're dealing with the tension of both periods, night and day. There's something beautiful about that tension. And so we shouldn't seek to rid ourselves of that tension, but rather we should seek to explore it, understand it, to capitalize on it, and to understand that that is truthfully a part of what life is all about. This inner conflict that Paul speaks of is nothing unnatural. It's nothing strange. In fact, it's something that we've all experienced. The challenge is, how do we live with this tension? And I didn't mention that last night. I saved that for today. How do we live with the tension of being completely alive? I believe that God is extremely wise, and God has a plan for the way that God works things out in our lives. We don't fully conceive of or understand that plan. Sometimes we challenge and question and even rail out in anger against God because we're so confused as to what it is that God could possibly intend by some of the challenges that we face in this life. Nevertheless, I believe that God intends us to be where we're at. I love that quote. You might have heard me say it before, that someone said that this must be the best of all possible worlds. Otherwise, God would have created it differently. So it becomes ours to learn how to live with this tension of being completely alive. Because God is so precise and orderly, I believe that God has a very simple solution to living with the tension of being completely alive, and that answer, that answer as to how to live is summed up in the Great Commandment. The Great Commandment is to love the Lord your God with all your heart and soul and mind and strength, and to love your neighbor as yourself. Did you ever spend time thinking about what is the imago Dei? Probably not. But you might have thought about what the image of God is. That's what I mean when I say imago Dei. the imago Dei, or the image of God, is that spiritual capacity, that divine capacity that is a part of each and every human being, as suggested by that first chapter of the book of Genesis, whereupon it says that when God created man and woman, God created man and woman in the image of God. What is that image that we are created in? Some have suggested it is the intellect. It is our intellectual capacity. Some have expressed that it's our ability to communicate. Some have expressed that it is a higher knowledge or ability to make decisions. It is the opportunity to take license in life and make choices and determinations about the way that things are going to be. I want to suggest to you today, and this is the first time that I've kind of come to this place in this context, but I really believe that there is truth in it. I believe that the image of God is our capacity to love. Do you remember in 1 Corinthians chapter 12, it speaks about the spiritual gifts. And then at the very end of 1 Corinthians chapter 12, the passage says, "But I will show you a more excellent way. I will show you a more excellent way." And then that opens up to 1 Corinthians chapter 13. And of course, 1 Corinthians chapter 13 begins, "If I speak in the tongues of mortals and of angels, but do not have love, I'm a noisy gong or a clanging cymbal. And if I have prophetic powers and understand all mysteries, if I have all faith, even so as to remove mountains, but do not have love, I have nothing. And if I give away all of my possessions and hand over my body so that I may boast, but do not have love, I gain nothing." And so faith, hope, love abide these three. And the greatest of these is love. I believe that love truly is the answer to 99.9% of all questions that we might have in life. Those of you who tuned in with me last night may recall, perhaps subliminally, perhaps intentionally, that to my left there was a little sign that I inherited from my mom, a little needlework sign that said, "Love is the answer, regardless of the question." The question today is how to deal with the inner conflict, how to live with the tension of being completely alive. I suggest to you that the answer is to love God with all your heart and soul and mind and strength, and to love your neighbor as yourself. Because in loving, we bring out that spiritual capacity, that divine nature that is within us, and it overwhelms our fleshly nature. It takes over, and we become so filled with the divine nature of God that we are indeed sanctified unto perfection for the prospect of being loving people, to love God and to love others. I gave a sermon outside recently, and a very astute person said, "You know, I got the point of the sermon. The question is, what's your answer to the question that you asked in the sermon?" The sermon was entitled "Transforming Receptivity." And my question was, whether or not we are willing to transform our receptiveness, whether or not we are willing to take hold of a transforming receptivity, whether or not we are willing to be open to others, to receive them in a way that goes beyond the ordinary, whether or not we are willing as God's people to show keen hospitality in relating to others, to welcome others, to be so inclined to welcome others that we are willing to give up a part of ourselves, that indeed in interaction with them we become something entirely new. Indeed, the sky is the limit as to what we can accomplish if we are only willing to be in a transformative receptivity with one another. This person asked me, what is that transforming receptivity? What does that look like? How can we accomplish that? That was a wonderful question, and I've been wrestling and praying about that question. One of the things that I did was to look up on the internet a very casual, kind of informal approach. What are the top 10 ways to show someone that you care? What are the top 10 ways to show someone that you care? Now, if you Google that, you'll find a number of different top 10 lists. And as I was reading through that list, it occurred to me that that list could be summed up very easily in one of my old standby illustrations that I'm sure that some of you have heard me use before. I was so taken with Gary Chapman's book, uh, The Five Languages of Love. I'm the sort of person, I don't tend to read a lot of books. I read certain books over and over and over again because I find great truth from those books. For instance, this book here, I spend a lot of time reading. I try to read it as many times as I can because no matter how many times I read it, I find something new because I'm in a different place in my life. But there are other books that I like to read over and over and over again. One of those books is The Five Languages of Love. Some people are of the understanding that that book was written primarily for spouses or for those in an intimate relationship of two people who are romantically fond of one another. Uh, but I want to urge you that book could be used in multiple capacities. There are ways in which we can utilize the five languages of love in relationship with our children, in relationship with our aging parent, in relationship with our spouse, of course, in relationship with our friends, in relationship with prospective members of the church, in relationship with people in the community that we want to draw close to. You see, the five languages of love, I believe, are universal in their capacity to demonstrate the practical application of loving. So what I'm endeavoring to say is that I have a very simple answer to how to transform our receptivity. And it's a theme that I'm going to be taking hold of over the next 6 months to a year with us as we get back on track as a church, as we make our way in this transition from coronavirus to the whole new world that exists beyond the coronavirus pandemic. And that theme is the theme of the basics are killing us. The basics are killing us. What I mean to say is that in order to transform our receptivity, in order for us to become the people that God wants us to be, in order for us to learn to live with the tension of being fully alive, what we need to do is get back to basics. We need to get back to the basics of loving each other. We need to get back to the basics of being warm and loving people even when they're not especially lovable. We need to get back to basics of hospitality and communication. We need to get back to the basics of quality time. We need to get back to the basics of finding that which other people love and finding ways to present it to them in ways that's going to be meaningful, that's going to bless them. I would suggest to you that the issue with the Christian church is not something that we haven't gotten hold of. It's not something out there somewhere that we have to find, but rather it is to be found at the core of what our faith is about, which is very simply a loving relationship between us and God and us and those whom God has called us to love. We are called to love God with all our heart and soul and mind and strength and to love our neighbors as we love ourselves. In this is our answer to how to live with the tension of being completely alive. Now, some of you are saying, you know, Rob, you mentioned those five languages of love. What are they, and how can I begin being the person that God calls me to be today so that I can begin to overcome this tension that I'm continually struggling with in my life? The five languages of love, as you recall with me, are quality time, words of affirmation, acts of service, giving gifts, and physical touch. Now you might say, but Rob, now you said physical touch. Now clearly that has to do with romantic love. I would argue that it does not. We have a very slippery slope to ride these days in life as it's challenging for us to connect with one another because the world has become rather chilly, sterile in some ways. It's hard to find appropriate ways to demonstrate love to one another. But once this coronavirus has gone by, I pray that we'll find new ways to express love to each other by giving one another hugs, by truly, meaningfully shaking a person's hand, or even by simply embracing someone with your eyes, by looking to them in their eyes and letting them know that you're listening to them. These are all means of physical encounter that don't have anything to do with romantic love, but are sorely needed in today's world. Physical touch, though, is perhaps the least of those uh, ways of loving that we should exercise as Christians. What would it mean if you were to take some time and spend time with someone who is lonely? What would it mean if you were to find someone's favorite food and you were to find a way to either make it or provide it for them and bring it to them as a gift, somewhat spontaneously, as a surprise? What would it mean if you were to learn what someone's challenges in life were and you were to find ways to serve them in ways that made their lives easier? And how hard would it be to say something very positive to someone in a way that's going to lift them up? I would argue that one of the challenges that we have as a church, and here I'm speaking both of we as the Christian church, but also we as members of the First United Methodist Church of Stamford, are not problems that lie beyond our reach, but rather we need to do the basics so much better. We need to start spending time loving each other the way that God calls on us to love one another. And we need to do so almost recklessly, where we let go of the physical nature and capacity, the earthly nature of who we are, and we take hold of that divine nature that is in us that calls us to love. You see, these very basic things are what's going to make us the church that we need to be. Now, you might say, where's the precedent for this, Bob? Why do you say that this is what's going to enable our church to grow? Some of you long-standing members of the First United Methodist Church of Stamford recall that there was some 50 years ago an extant group of people who built this church and made it what it is today. And that group of people, a group of people that were known as the Fellowship Club. Remember the Fellowship Club? Everybody came out and they came to know each other and they got together and they walked and talked together and they visited one another's homes and they ate together and they encouraged one another and they had deep, meaningful relationships with one another. I want to find a way to recultivate the Fellowship Club in today's world among our people and among people who would become members of our church, because that's the key to what it means to be a Christian community, a loving community, a community of trust and support, a community where you can depend upon one another. You see, these are the basic elements that it's going to take for us to build the church into what we desire for it to be. Not something fancy, some newfangled opportunity that's coming down the road, but it's our taking time to build meaningful relationships in ways that make a transformative difference in people's lives. You see, once we begin thinking in this way, our corporeal nature is overwhelmed with the vision of being the people that God calls us to be. And this, my friends, I believe, is how to live with the tension of being completely alive. When you find yourself in the midst of that inner conflict, turn to God in love and turn to your neighbor in service. Give them quality time. Give them opportunity to speak and offer them words of affirmation. Spend some time figuring out what they like and give them what they like as a gift. And put your hand on their back and say, you know, I care about you. And look in their eyes and let them know that you genuinely do care. These are the small things, the basics, that will make a big difference in people's lives if only we'll free ourselves up to do it. Now, some of you have learned about me that I like to listen to and watch comedy. I tend to like Kevin Gaffigan because he's a clean comic, but I like all the comics, I have to be honest. And there's one that I've been taken with here recently. Some of you may have seen him on Netflix, and please forgive me, he's not always speaking the right way that we might like him to speak, or using the right metaphors. Nevertheless, he makes a powerful point in a bit that he did about 10, 15 years ago. His name is Sebastian Maniscalco. You might have seen him on Netflix. I encourage you to look him up. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing his last name exactly correctly, but he's an Italian fellow from Long Island who has a particular brand of comedy. About 10, 15 years ago, he did a bit talking about company. He said it used to be that when company was going to come to the house, we'd have a special coffee cake someplace in the house, especially waiting for when company came. The living room would be would be arranged in such a way that that we would be ready for the arrival of company at any given moment. And children weren't to play in the living room because we wanted to preserve that room and keep it pristine for the possibility that company might come. When company came, we laid out fine china and we served all of the best foods, and we did everything that we could to demonstrate our caring hospitality to those who were coming. When company came, the whole family gathered around and we shared together and spent time. We might even generate into playing some board games and spending times until wee hours of the morning. And then when company left, there was a quiet, happy glow that came over the house as the children went off to sleep and as we sipped a few final sips of coffee and made our ways to bed as well. Company used to be a wonderful thing. But what Sebastian talks about is the fact that presently, if somebody rings the doorbell, everybody's quiet. They stop talking immediately and they say, don't let anybody know that we're here. Because the last thing we want is for these strange, weird people to be coming in our house. Get rid of them. That's the answer. Now, Sebastian does a much better job dramatizing this representation. Nevertheless, I think you understand what I'm trying to say. There have been changes in our world that have made us distant, that have made us separate and segregated and distinct. I'm suggesting that we need to break down some of those barriers and get back to some good old-fashioned fellowship. I'll never forget as a child growing up in the United Methodist Church, the wonderful fellowship suppers and dinners and opportunities to visit people's homes and swim in different pools and to be together going to different places on bike trips and on mission trips and on camping trips and just building friendships, building relationships. That's what church was all about, the fellowship. Fellowship came to mean something very special. It was something more than just coming together. It was the spirit of love that attended to Christian fellowship. That's what we need.